This is Think It Through with me, April A. Bear. Get ready to start thinking. I know, it's hard, and you'd probably rather not. But here we go anyway. Hello, and welcome to Think It Through. Today's episode is a long one, but I'm pretty sure you'll want to stick around till the end. I have to say that I know some pretty cool people, and you're going to meet one of them today. I met Ed Dentzel over 20 years ago when we were both actors at Star Trek The Experience in Las Vegas. He's now the host of the Unfound Podcast. While it does fall into the category of true crime, Unfound is unlike any other podcast of his genre. It focuses solely on missing persons, with the stated goal of turning up new information that might lead to a resolution of the case. As it states on the Unfound Podcast website, the disappeared shouldn't be missing forever. Ed's always been a clear-headed, logical guy, and his team's approach to the podcast is to research all the available information, interview those closest to the case, lay out all the known facts, and let people know who to contact if they have any information regarding the disappearance. His logic and evidence-based approach to helping find these missing persons is a breath of fresh air in the world of true crime podcasting, which often focuses on the most horrendous or salacious details to keep listeners interested. As a teacher of critical thinking, I appreciate how Ed applies good research and reasoning skills to this difficult but ultimately fulfilling task. So without further ado, let's listen to my interview with Ed Dentzel of Unfound. Let's start basically by talking about how we know each other. How do we know each other, Ed?
Well, we know each other by me getting hired at Star Trek in May of 2000. And I have to tell you, it is still etched in my memory that the day I was there, that I was going for my audition, that you took a picture of me, just like probably back at the time with, I don't know, the one of those cameras that actually spits the photo out, whatever they forget. I mean, it was so old. It's so long ago. But I remember you taking a picture of me in the back stairwell as we were walking up to Bridge 2.
What was it for? Do you remember?
From my audition. That's when we first met. Okay. You took a picture of me. Okay. That's how we first met, so you could keep track of everybody who was being auditioned, because at that time you were still in management. And that is how we met. And then we ended up working together for 4.5 years until I left there in October of 2004. So I was there about 4.5 years. Of course, everybody knows you were there for the whole time.
Yeah. Well, we had fun at Star Trek The Experience.
Oh, yeah, we did.
I still call it the best job in the galaxy. It really, really was.
Yeah, it was the best job I had until I started doing this, for sure. And coincidentally, I've been doing this for about the same amount of time that I was at Star Trek, about 4.5 years.
So tell me how you segued or morphed or whatever from being an actor into being the host of the Unfound Podcast.
Well, I have to tell you that it was a long time coming, probably. It was a combination of things for me. First of all, I'm 50 now, that I remember in the 1970s when the show In Search of course, Leonard Nimoy hosting it, was a big deal on Saturdays. And I can remember watching that as a kid, 1975, 76, 77, somewhere in there. And always fascinated. Of course, now I look back at it, now it was probably somewhat hokey. And some of those things were, I think, kind of made up, just for TV.
Yes.
But it caught my, just living in Gilpin Township in Leechburg, Pennsylvania. It was like, wow, there's this crazy world out there. And then it moved into cops in the 1980s, unsolved mysteries. And then the internet came along, and I love looking up, mysteries of the world, things disappearing, Amelia Earhart, things like that. And then on top of that, that was combined. I always had an interest in that. But then a lot of the skills that I learned at Star Trek are ones that I use for the program. Probably one of the biggest is improvisation. and having to know how to do that. Of course, back in the day when the ride would break down, we had to entertain those people, and you had to know how to talk and stay in character because these people paid good money to be entertained, even if the ride's not working. So you're stuck in a room with 27 people, and you have to learn how to talk and off the top of your head. And we now know about acting. You know, what I learned is that acting is not about acting; it's about reacting.
Absolutely.
And so for those 4.5 years of doing that, it's I know that I use those skills now when I interview people for the program, because once again, it's about reacting to what they say, not me planning to know what I'm going to say. They are the guest. They're the person with the information. So I have to react to what they say to keep the conversation going in the right direction, or maybe if something needs fleshed out a little bit more. So it was my, I think, innate interest in mysteries, along with a lot of skills that I gained at Star Trek, performing in front of people, how to write. Of course, as you know, I did some filmmaking, how to write scripts. I've written some novels. And then the technology of podcasting came along. I guess maybe a little over 10 years ago, it became a thing. And it's probably become a thing in true crime, maybe within the last 7 or 8 years in particular. And it all just kind of came together. But I did do another program before this, the title of which I never say, but I co-hosted a true crime podcast that lasted about 5 or 6 episodes, and that fell apart. And that was like in April through July of 2016. But in doing that, I was able to figure out what I liked and what I didn't like about that program. And so then when Unfound started in September of 2016, it's like my second marriage. I figured out what I did wrong in my first marriage. Now I can correct all those things from my second marriage. So I'm on my second marriage, and it's going pretty well.
So there are so many podcasts out there about true crime. I mean, just so many. But yours is very specific, though.
Yeah.
And so what about what you do interested you as opposed to just, true crime in general?
Well, I have to tell you something. This blows everybody's mind when I tell them this. This is the honest to God truth. When I started doing this program, I had no idea that the true crime podcasting world was so huge. I now know about the podcast Serial. I've never listened to it. Not one episode. I got into it, and I think the reason that Unfound is so different is because I didn't come in with any preconceptions about what a podcast was supposed to sound like, and what you were supposed to do. I think that looking back at it now, a lot of the hosts, and I'm not criticizing them, but they are different. They speak with that very NPR tone, very monotone, very soft. And all their programs are like less than an hour long or whatever else. And that's mandated usually by, somebody else. Me, I do 3-hour podcasts, and I don't even think about it. Right. I use my own voice, dynamic. And in fact, I got some criticisms for that originally. He doesn't sound like a podcast host. He doesn't, is his voice too dynamic? He should be in theater or something. And I do come from kind of theater, so I guess that makes sense. Yeah. But being that I never listened to any other true crime podcasts, I didn't know there was like, quote unquote, a way to sound and what to do. And I think that's what makes Unfound so different. Now, as far as specializing disappearances, that's something that's always been very compelling to me, even well before starting the program. Once again, going back to my youth, going to websleuths.com, going to namus.gov, and looking at unidentified remains and matching up with missing people was something that I used to do at Starbucks in Las Vegas before I moved to Florida. I'd be sitting there and just kind of hanging out, and that's what I'd be doing. That's just kind of where my mind went. I was never really interested in serial killers or the supernatural or anything. Disappearances just were very compelling to me. So once again, it's all that combined is how Unfound got made.
You gave me a list of ideas that you wanted to talk about, but yeah, I'd like to start with what makes solving disappearances so tough. And we do need to start with the idea that the vast majority of people who are reported missing show up, basically.
Yes, they do. That's true.
Within just a very short
amount of time.
Maybe
Possibly deceased, but the most disappearances are solved fairly quickly.
Quickly. That's why that TV show is called 48 Hours, right? Because it's that first 48 hours that's critical.
Right.
When someone goes missing. So less than a very, very short amount of time, except for a tiny, tiny percentage of those people. And these are the people that you're interested in.
Right.
So these are people that just never show up again.
Right. What makes solving disappearances so difficult? This is my insight 4.5 years into this. And I love theories. If you're into the Myers-Briggs test, I'm an INTP. We love messing around with theories and things. We're called the absent-minded professors, and I certainly can be that way sometimes. The tough part is that in those first few days of disappearances, the people who are going to come back or be found alive or deceased in those first few days, let's just say 72 hours, their disappearances look exactly like the disappearances of people who are going to be missing maybe forever. It all looks the same, at least to our perception as humans.
Right.
Okay. Now, if we were to plug all of this data points into a computer or something with an algorithm, like a chess program or something, it may be able to figure out someday how to weed the ones that are going to last a long time from the ones that aren't. But what happens is that most police officers, investigators, they'll work their entire careers, averages 25 to 30 years in law enforcement. They will never encounter a missing persons case that lasts longer than a few days. Most of them. That's how rare these types of disappearances are, even though they're still very important in how they destroy people's lives.
Right.
It's horrible.
Yeah.
It's horrible.
Yeah.
But what happens is that an investigator can go 15 years and never experience a disappearance. So what happens, you get very complacent. It becomes like the boy who cried wolf, and that, okay, here we go, another disappearance. Here's another worried mother about her 18-year-old daughter. She's freaked out. She didn't come home last night. And the police officer's thinking, well, in all my prior experience, this young woman's going to show up in a few days. Here she, maybe she had an addiction, or she has some boyfriend and they ran off to Vegas and got married, and they'll be back in a couple days, and it's no big deal. And a lot of times this is what these police officers who show up at these doors of these parents say. They say, oh, don't worry about it. Don't worry. She'll be back in a few days. And they blow it off because that is their experience.
Yeah.
That is their experience from, once again, it could be 10 years, 15 years of never experiencing something like that. And then all of a sudden you have a real true disappearance where the person is going to be gone for a long time. And so I have a lot of guests on the program who have been insulted by police officers. In fact, it's well known, even though it's a disappearance that's not, that we've not covered. Jennifer Kessie, who disappeared in Orlando like over 15 years ago. She's still missing. Professional young woman in real estate, living on her own. And the police officer who showed up said, oh, don't worry. She's probably off with some guy. She'll be back in a few days. This is not the type of young woman who would miss her job. But this is what the police officer said anyway. Yeah. And this is common. It's only well known in her case because her disappearance is well known. This is happening all the time in disappearances that a lot of people don't know about, and many that we've covered on Unfound. So that's what makes trying to solve disappearances so difficult, is because the ones that are going to be solved quickly all on their own look like the ones that the police are actually going to have to put some work into eventually. But then it's 3 days, a week, a month. I mean, we had a disappearance, Eric Franks in Michigan, where his police report or his missing persons report wasn't filed for 10 months because his family was convinced that he was still alive out there somewhere,
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
No, I did a little research and I found that municipal and state law enforcement agencies have what they call best practices protocol that they follow when they're, when someone's reported missing. But it seems to me like what you're saying is that protocol really doesn't address the major issues associated with long-term missing people.
No, it doesn't. And once again, it's missing persons. The way I would explain it is they are rare. I'm not going to, sit here. Now, I know there are people out there who will tell you that it's happening all the time and they'll cite these statistics. And surely there's probably 100,000 unsolved missing persons cases in the United States, as far as back as we can tell that are true missing persons cases. And that's horrible, but it is in a country of 330 million people.
Right.
But they're still horrible.
You're talking about like 50 years and
right. That's right. Even longer than that. But still and so it's rare, but they're important. And the reason they are important is because, of course, I believe a majority of these are murders and they destroy families' lives.
Oh, absolutely.
If parents get divorced because of a child going missing, family members, take on addictions, they commit suicide, of course, suffer from depression and everything else. So it's not just that missing person who has probably been damaged and harmed. There are a lot of other people who are still around who aren't missing, who have been harmed as well because of it. And that's why I think that we have to get a better handle on this in the United States, because a lot of these people, their lives have been ruined.
So you have, it says missing persons theory here. You discovered over, the 4 years you've been working on this podcast.
Yeah.
Even the FBI doesn't really have any kind of profile about a
No, they don't. What they do is they have theory on serial killers. We've all heard about criminal profiling. We have theories, though, that are very solid regarding crime in the United States, why it happens, where it happens, who does it. And I think that we have enough disappearances that we can start to draw a lot of inferences from them and try to compare disappearances that are similar. Women who are working alone at a job and get kidnapped or abducted in the middle of the night. That's not the most common, but that's a thing. There are certainly enough instances like that where we can start to draw inferences about who does this, why was it done, using how long was the woman working there, what was the nature of the job, did she ever have any complaints about any customers in the past, on and on and on. These things aren't done because, once again, I think a lot of people, law enforcement, look at the numbers and say, well, this isn't worth the time to put into it because we have all these other issues going on. And these disappearances, there's just not enough of them to care about that deeply, even though the FBI is responsible sometimes, of course, for children when they go missing or any disappearances that could cross state lines. But still, these are crimes that people are getting away with. And that's all we should care about. But nobody's working on that. Nobody's trying to draw any conclusions from, for example, disappearances that are solved. What can we learn from these disappearances that are solved after 20 years and the remains are found buried in somebody's backyard? What can we learn? And then can we go to other disappearances that are still unsolved and say, well, you know what? Maybe what happened in this one that's solved happened in these 10 over here. And that gives us new lines of inquiry. I don't know of anybody who's doing that.
Wow.
I could not tell you anybody at any level of law enforcement in the United States that's doing something like that.
Well, you should do it.
Well, I am doing it. There's only 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week. And I certainly probably am the only person out there that's talking about missing persons theory and how you can go about, forming theories and drawing, some inferences and maybe some decent conclusions about narrowing down the possibilities of what could have happened in a particular disappearance.
But as you say, if you have enough examples of, people who were eventually found either alive or dead, you should be able to, given all that information, that data, be able to compile, some kind of profile of.
That's right.
Not just the person that took them, but the missing people themselves. That's
exactly right. I can tell you that just off the top of my head, the number one reason people go missing is because they're in relationships. I can tell you that single people, as long as they stay away from drugs and addictions and everything, they have a less likely chance of going missing than people who are in relationships. Relationships are the number one cause of disappearances, mainly, of course, men causing the women in their lives to disappear.
either the woman takes off and doesn't want to be found, or
right, or the guy has done something to her.
Right. Yeah.
That's number one. And then second and third, people with risky lifestyles and drugs would be second. I think a lot of people would think that those are number one, but they aren't. It's certainly relationships.
No, I think domestic violence is.
Yeah, domestic violence, sure. And it does, domestic violence that goes so far. But what you find out in some of the disappearances that we've covered, there was no history of domestic violence in that marriage or relationship until the day the woman went missing. And then the guy starts telling all these weird stories about how, she took off. Some guy came in a white truck and picked her up and just took her off. Can't describe the truck. Can't give a license plate number, doesn't know who the guy was, but we're supposed to believe this, husband or something. Yeah. So domestic violence in a way, but you'd be surprised how many of these disappearances where guys start telling weird stories after the fact, the relationship had no history of domestic violence.
Wow.
But obviously you could call it domestic violence was the cause of her disappearance. Yes. A fight that went, too far. Yes. But then drugs. And I think that's, something else that we need to mix in here is that, how do I say this? Law enforcement just really is not motivated to find what they call junkies and addicts and prostitutes who go missing. I'm not saying that every police officer in every jurisdiction in the United States thinks that way, but it's enough to matter. It's certainly enough to matter that they take the disappearance of 10-year-old children much more seriously than a 22-year-old prostitute who has a heroin addiction. Even though the people who are left behind, the parents, family members, or friends, feel the same way. Obviously, we have Amber Alerts and everything else for 10-year-olds. But if a 21-year-old prostitute goes missing, they'll say, oh, well, we don't know what to do. We'll take the report. Hope she turns up. Good luck.
And that's it. That's
really it. But on the other hand, and I try to see both sides of it, the issue is, especially with addicts, they do disappear sometimes and then come back. And then sometimes they don't come back. They'll be gone on a 3-day bender, come back. Everything's fine for a week. And then they'll go away again for 3 days and come back. And then those 3 days, the next time turn into 5 days, then a week, then a month. And it makes it difficult. But still, there's something that needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, I can see what you're talking about. And I do like that you try to see the issue from both sides. Yes, even though the police...
I try to. I try to.
Necessarily doing everything they can. They may not be able to. Their hands might be tied in certain circumstances. They only have so many things that they have the time, and the resources to do. So honestly, that's kind of where you come in.
That is kind of where I come in. And in addition, at least here in the United States, it's not against the law for some adult to walk out of his or her life.
Right.
That's not against the law. And, as I've stated, it's not against the law until they don't pay their taxes, and then the IRS is like, well, where's our money? And then it becomes an issue. Until that point, people are free to do this. And I will say that we have covered some disappearances where I think that somebody did walk off to start a new life because things weren't that great. But they're not that common. There's no facts in any of the other disappearances that I think those are what I call walk-offs for people starting new lives, in contrast to a walk-off where somebody's going to commit suicide or walked off to do drugs somewhere and overdosed and their body still hasn't been found yet.
I think that it would be difficult, particularly these days, to just walk out of your life and start a new one.
Well, you'd think... but it's just within the last few years, we've discovered it. I'm even starting to open my mind up to the idea that people walking out of their lives and starting new ones or staying off the grid somewhere is probably at least a little more common than we think. I'm not going to say that, if it's 0.5% of the, maybe I came into this thinking it's like 0.05% of the entire disappearance disappearance community of people who've disappeared. Maybe I can bump that up to like 0.1 or something. But it's certainly, I think, more than I thought, because we're finding out more and more that more stories are appearing. I'm thinking of a young woman. I think she was like 14 years old from Virginia, didn't like her home life. She just on her own moved to New York City, and she changed her name. Wow. She was like very waspy, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. She made herself look like she was Hispanic, changed her hairstyle, everything else, and she gave herself an Hispanic name. She got married, had children, and it wasn't until her kids got to a certain age where they started asking, hey, where's grandma? Hey, where's the rest of our family? That this woman decided, you know what, I'm going to get back in touch with my family after 15 years or something, like 12 years or something.
What was that like for her family? That must have been...
I've not covered that disappearance, but this is just an example of what I mean. And we had another, I didn't cover this one because it got solved before I even started Unfound, I think, maybe, that she went missing from Pennsylvania. And then years and years and years later, this woman committed suicide in Texas. And here it was this woman who disappeared from Pennsylvania, that she had taken the name of a baby who died at birth in Oregon. And she got married, and she told her husband that, you know, there's stuff in this lockbox that I don't ever want you to see. Don't ever look in there. And after she died, he opened it up, and it revealed that she was this woman from Pennsylvania. I forget the name now. But so there is proof that these things happen, but it's just rare. Very rare.
Yeah. Yeah. So why don't you just explain a little bit about the structure of your podcast?
Sure.
Like when you have an episode, what is it that you do?
Sure. The structure has been about the same since the start of the program. And once again, this goes back to the program that I did before that, and just trying to think, well, is that the best way to do it? And I thought the best way for me to do the program is introduction right at the beginning, very short, 30-second, 35-second, very general idea of what happened, and the music plays. And I love to work with themes. I guess that's my artsy-fartsy background, creative background. I love to work with themes when I write and when I speak. And so I try to create a theme, kind of get people in the mood. As you know, you never know where people are going to be when they choose to listen to our shows. So I try to get them in that mood, you know, for like a minute and a half. And then I go through the summary even deeper, a longer, maybe 3-paragraph, explaining who the person is, the details of the disappearance, and then some questions that people should be thinking about as they listen to the interview. Then I get some business stuff out of the way, tell people what's going on with the podcast behind the scenes, tell them to go to the website, Facebook, etc. And then the interview plays. And the way I do interviews is that, as we were talking about before we started, that I do scripted interviews. And I don't mean scripted as I tell the people what to say, but an outline. We use outlines for every interview that I've ever done for the program, because I don't want to miss anything. I want the people to be prepared. They use those outlines as what I might call a cheat sheet. They can go down through it, the outline, before we start, to make sure, you know, they know, where we're going. And those outlines are made from all the prior discussions I had with those people, because I take notes. I get permission to record those phone calls, and then I listen to them afterwards and write down everything that was said. And then if I think that I need to look into anything, I do. So then the interview plays for however long it takes. They are real conversations. I do not do a situation where I just let the person talk and then I insert my questions afterwards. I want the people to know that we are having a real conversation, you know, from start to end. And of course, we may take breaks or something. Those things are taken out. Any mistakes are taken out. And at the end, I will go through a very short 3 to 5 minute summation, just telling the listeners what caught my ear regarding the interview. And that's it. We don't do any theorizing on the program, because I like to make sure that the listeners come to their own conclusions. And what I found over 4.5 years is I start voicing my theories in public, and then it's amazing how everybody just starts thinking the same way. And I don't want people to do that. As I said, I think I've coined the term, if we knew what happened, we could just go solve it right now. They're listening to the same interview that I conducted. People are smart. A lot of people take interest in disappearances. They can come to their own conclusions. So they don't need to be spoon-fed theories and everything. They can come up with their own, and nobody is right or wrong.
I really like that about your podcast. I mean, as a critical thinker and someone who hopefully teaches people to think critically, you do a really good job of just laying out the information. And it's more about, look, here's what we do know, this, and this. Mm-hmm. And you don't, from what I can tell, you don't lead these people that you're talking to at all. And if you have an idea about what you think happened, you really, if you say it, you say, this is only my idea.
Yeah.
Based on my knowledge, but in no way is that the truth of what happened.
It's funny. I think that the listeners probably be surprised how much, I wouldn't say that the discussions are contentious or anything behind the scenes before the guests are on the program. Surely not that. But I do try to get the guests out of their comfort zones because of course, a lot of times they've been living with a disappearance for 30 years. And so they've been interviewed many times over. And so a lot of them do have canned answers. It's just after a while, they just say the same things. And I'm not saying they're lying. I think they're telling the truth. But sometimes I'm probably a little more confrontational with them regarding some of their ideas than probably other interviewers are. But that's, once again, part of the reason I do things the way I do is that we get that all ironed out beforehand. We can have these very deep discussions that are off the record, and then we do the interview and, ask the questions and they answer them. But behind the scenes, I think that I'm probably a little more confrontational than your average true podcast interviewer, because once again, I like getting people out of their comfort zones, maybe trying to get them to think about a fact or something in a different way, and they also know that I'm not trying to kiss their butts. I'm trying to help.
But helping them to maybe say something, that they just realized that they just really didn't know, or they did know it, but it kind of got pushed to the side. And so you do a really good job of
Thank you.
The way you answer or ask the questions.
Thank you.
I think it's great.
That's that Star Trek training.
That's
Star
right.
Trek.
So how many times have you found people, do come up with missing information, or that they didn't really stop to think about?
First of all, some of the disappearances that we've covered on the program have been solved. I'm thinking the number, we've done over 200 episodes now. I'm thinking somewhere around 15 or so have come to some sort of conclusion. Either somebody's been charged or remains have been found, or a combination of both. I would never say that, I or my assistants or we, the program, solved it. There are people out there doing that. And unfortunately, as I like to point out, too many of these disappearances are solved by luck. Somebody just walking through the woods and someone remains. Right. That's common.
Yeah.
That's common. But I would say, I guess this is probably the episode that kind of put Unfound on the map was during the summer of 2018. I covered the disappearance of Thomas Brown in Canadian Texas. It's one of the longest episodes, maybe not the longest, but in the top 5. And in that one, from the beginning, Tom's mother, Penny, believed that there could have been law enforcement involvement in his disappearance. Wow. And that was something she told me within the first 10 minutes I ever spoke to her in about April of 2018. Somewhat doubtful of that, but you should know that your listeners should know the stats from Unfound show that almost 10% of disappearances, if there is a suspect who is thought to be probably the killer or something, 10% of the time it's somebody in law enforcement. That's a stat. That is a fact. So what happened with that is she had video that had never been made public before, or it had been made public, but it had not been looked at in the way that I looked at it. And what was happening, everybody was looking at the video, looking for Tom in his red Durango SUV the night of his disappearance, riding around Canadian Texas, which is like up in the north central part of Texas. And you can't really tell. The video is not good enough from the video that she had. So instead I thought, well, you know what? If she thinks that law enforcement involved, let's see if I can see any police cars. Nobody did that. So I spent many nights looking through many hours of all these different angles of these videos of this file that she sent me. And it turned out that right around the time we knew where Tom was last, he got gas at this particular gas station called Frank's, Well, just a few minutes after that, there were two sheriff deputies' cars coming from that direction. And that started a bunch of stuff. PG rated stuff.
I'll bet.
And now what's interesting about that is I'm not even saying that I believe that any police officer or sheriff or sheriff's deputy had anything to do with the disappearance. But what it did was it certainly more supported what she thought. I'm not saying that Penny's correct. Okay. Now you should know Tom Brown's remains were found in January of 2019, 12 miles away from where his Durango was found. 12 miles. And there were partial remains. No cause of death could be determined, but they're going to have a grand jury this year to find out if he was murdered or not. In the meantime, the sheriff of that county had to resign because he was caught lying about some other things. He admitted forging paperwork regarding the investigation into Tom's disappearance.
Wow.
A couple of the other, now on top of that, one of the deputies that I saw on the video that night just happened to come across Tom's remains. He's the one who found them. Now I've talked to it. I've talked to him. We get along perfectly fine. I mean, and one of my assistants is much more in contact with him, keeping, tabs on him and talking to him and everything. But this didn't help. Being that this started with Penny thinking that law enforcement had something to do with this disappearance, and then all these other things happen. You find out the sheriff was cooking the books on a lot of things. He was in over his head, and your listeners can go listen to that episode, Thomas Brown, from I think June of 2018. You can go listen to it for yourselves. But there hasn't been much since then that has detracted people from that idea, because the alternative is that he walked those 12 miles all by himself
and then dropped dead in the woods.
And dropped dead. A teenager just dropped dead. There was no knife. There was no gun. There was no signs that he hung himself. There's no allegations that somebody gave him any drugs that he could have overdosed. Well, how does a young man die, in November of, 2016 in Canadian Texas, just out in the middle of nowhere? It's just hard to understand, but they're going to try to figure that out this year in Texas grand jury. But this is like one of the things. So when I saw that video and saw those sheriff's deputies' vehicles, that's an example of how, wow, just everything. And I suddenly became a household name in Canadian Texas, Hemphill County, Texas. And that's why I think a lot of people found the program. So that's just one example.
Yeah. Well, aren't you a household name now? Because the Unfound Podcast has been on national television.
Yeah, 48 hours. Yeah, I just talked about that this past week. That was a total surprise. That was not something that I knew was going to happen. It was an interview that I did with a suspected killer of Janelle Matthews from 1984, Steve Pankey, who is going to be going on trial this summer. I was very fortunate to be able to interview him back when a lot of other people were turning him down for whatever reason. I accepted the offer to interview him as long as he did it by my rules. And we did that in October of 2019. And then 48 Hours finds that interview and uses it for their coverage over a week ago. Yeah.
Well, you got cred now, dude. You totally have.
I guess, yes.
So you talk about applying logic to what might seem to be illogical situations.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, I can. Absolutely. One of the tough things, being that your program is about thinking, is that logic should guide us in our decisions. Sometimes we do go with our emotions, but I think it's usually better to go just trying to track, what's going to be the consequences of my decisions. We have to look at that. We have to use that when we cover disappearances as well. The tough part with disappearances is there is so much information that is unknown. If your listeners are not familiar with disappearances, we hardly ever talk about DNA, ever, because there usually is none.
Right.
We hardly ever talk about fingerprints because there usually are none. Or if there are, it might have been somebody who had a perfectly reasonable reason to be in that area anyway, so they're not helpful. Right. So we end up having to use other sort of data like GPS, social media, phone pings, things like that, sightings, video, and things that, even though we think that they are just as good as DNA, they aren't. They can be interpreted in a variety of ways. Yeah. That's the hard part. So when I'm talking to a guest and they're telling me everything that's gone on over, let's say, the last 20 years, I'm trying to find those holes in their story where I think something can be, pushed forward. But what you run into is that a lot of times you're presented with facts that don't make any sense. I will give you a perfect example. Just this past Friday, we covered the disappearance of Brenda Condon from Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. Right. It's a disappearance that's over 30 years old. She was working late night by herself at a bar. Next day, workers come in. She's not there. It seems that somebody abducted her that early morning of February 27th in 1991. Well, one of the weird facts of her disappearance is that her boots were found in the men's restroom of the bar. Now, I don't know why her boots would be there. In addition, it might not even be an aspect, a part of the disappearance or not. Right. But being that it is so odd, we are forced to think about it. And we have to come up with all these reasons. Well, why would a woman put her boots in the men's restroom? And does that or does that not have something to do with her disappearance? Okay. We're trying to, something that seems illogical. Once again, boots in a men's restroom, women's boots in a men's restroom. And we're trying to figure out, well, what was in Brenda's mind when she did that? Or did she even do it? So it's very easy to come try to use logic, but sometimes these things cannot be logically figured out because we can't, the person's gone. The person's gone. We can't ask her. Now, it very well may be that she put those boots there for a very logical reason, but because we weren't there, we don't know. We just have no idea. And we're not even sure if that has anything to do with the disappearance or not. Probably the best example, and I think in the notes that I sent you, is the disappearance of Brian Shaffer from Columbus, Ohio, and trying to figure out why is it that he went into the Ugly Tuna and never was seen leaving the Ugly Tuna 15 years ago when he disappeared. Is that part of the reason that he disappeared, or does it have nothing to do with his disappearance? We just don't know. It very well could be. But, you get so caught up on that tangent, what we call going down rabbit holes, is that you miss the bigger picture. Yes. Does this have anything to do with his disappearance? Brian is still missing. Does it really matter if he was seen on the video or not? Once again, with Brenda.
Our brains are like patterns. We like consistency, we like patterns. And so when, you talk about somebody's boots in the men's room, your brain starts to try and make a connection between that and something else when there may be absolutely none, so without any more information than that, it is a fact, but it has nothing to do with the overall case unless you can find another connection that is also a fact.
Right.
You could speculate till the cows come home.
That's right. And I even looking at my notes here, I gave you also some examples of Shane Fell, a young man from Louisiana. I think this disappearance is about 10 years old now, that he wrecked on his way home. Could have absolutely been drinking and driving. I'm not going to say he wasn't. In fact, the thought is he was taking this way to get around a DUI checkpoint. He wrecks his car, flips it, gets out, calls his brother on his cell phone. Brother says, yeah, man, I just wrecked my, car. Can you come pick me up? His brother shows up 20 minutes later. Shane is gone. Never seen again. Now, how do you connect that? I mean, who calls somebody to pick them up and then the person isn't there? But what I've discovered is this is a thing in disappearances. I've covered 2 other disappearances that are exactly like that. I have them once again in my notes. Deborah Bowman from right here in Largo, Florida. Longer than that ago, she went to the hospital, called to get picked up. When her landlord came to pick her up, she wasn't there. Never seen again. And then one that is solved, and maybe this could give us some insight into it in this phenomenon, Crystal Morrison in North Carolina, once again, about 10 years ago. She was at work, wasn't feeling well, got to lunchtime. She called the guy, kind of a father figure of hers, who was watching her son, come pick me up. I'm not feeling well. Took the guy about, 20 minutes to get to her job. She wasn't there. Never seen again. at the end of 2019, her remains were found about a mile away in the woods. Here it seems she just walked off, and there was video of her being in a convenience store. So it seems that after she called from her job to be picked up, she took off. She went down to the Shell station like a half mile away to get something to drink, and then she walked off to these woods and died. And there's no evidence of foul play. Her family is very content to believe that she died out in those woods. A combination of being sick, she was a recovering addict, and it was like 100 degrees in that area of North Carolina that day. It was a combination of things that she might have had a heat stroke and just walked off into the woods and died. And the reason she wasn't found this long is because her remains were on private property. The owner did not allow that area to be searched back at the time. She was found by some surveyors. They were going to be widening the road or something, so they had eminent domain. They went on this person's property, come across her remains. You still can't explain why she would call. The guy's going to be there in 20 minutes and she's walking down to a Shell station.
No, there's no explanation. I mean,
I just don't know.
You can speculate, but we'll never know for sure.
Yeah, so I think what I'm saying is logic can only take us so far. You need a lot more information than you usually have in disappearances to come to some firm, logical conclusions, for sure.
It's interesting, though, but there is nothing wrong. People think that they should always have an answer for everything. You should be able to come to some conclusion, but there are just as many times when, without enough information, all you can say is, I don't know. Yep. I don't know. There's not enough information. I say that a lot. Yeah, but there's something like in people's minds where saying I don't know is somehow weak, or it makes them look like they're stupid or something like that. And so, it's better to come up with a conclusion, even if it's wrong. But I do not think that.
Yeah, right. You got it. I don't know is the first step to understanding. The way I look at it, and when you admit that you don't know something, that just shows you what you need to find out.
So, and you talk about how analyzing facts depends on culture, and I'm not quite sure what you mean when you say that. So,
okay, this is fascinating. This is something that once again, you never know what's going to pop up in a conversation you have with somebody. I was talking to my assistant Eric Grabowski. In fact, I don't even think he was my assistant at that time, but he was originally a guest of the program back in 2017 for the disappearance of Donna Mikalenko. And a woman who disappeared in his area of North Dakota. In fact, it's the oldest unsolved missing persons case in North Dakota. It's from, I think, 1968. And he's taken an interest in it. He lives there. He's originally from the Western Pennsylvania area like I am. And he actually went to the same college that I did, but he graduated a few years after I did. But and so we've met a couple times in Western Pennsylvania to get together. But one time, it must have been like 3 years ago now, we were talking about just disappearances, and he loves to talk about missing persons theory like I do. And we were talking about Donna's case. And one of the facts about her was that although she was had children, and I don't know if she was married or might have been living with a boyfriend or something, but it was known to her family that she would go away once in a while for days at a time back in the 1960s. And then she'd come back and her husband or ex-husband would take care of the kids, and she would go away and come back. And nobody to this day seemingly knows what she was doing during that time. Maybe she was living a double life. Maybe she was going to Vegas. We don't know, but I think a lot of them think that she was going to some type of quote unquote spa. Maybe that's what they called it back then, but it might have been for mental issues or something like that. No proof of that. Okay, no proof. But looking back on it now, this is kind of what our family thinks. Well, if you were to talk about that same disappearance in 2021, and you talked about a grown woman, mother, who would disappear for a few days at a time, the last thing you would think is that she was going to some mental health center and getting help or anything like that. I know in my world, having covered a lot of disappearances where people would disappear for a few days and then come back, is those people usually have a drug habit.
Right, yeah.
So you can have a set of facts in 1968 that make you think one way, But then you look at those same facts 50 years later, because things have changed regarding mental health and the stigmatization of that, or the unstigmatization of it, and the rise in addiction in the United States. And we know how addicts act, just how the culture has changed in those few areas can cause us to look at how a person's actions in a totally different way. I mean, couldn't be much more of a bigger difference between somebody going to get help at a health clinic, even though back then, once again, it was very hush, hush, hush. And then in the 21st century, where the same woman would be going on a heroin bender for 3 days.
If
I mean, the totally opposite ends.
Back in North Dakota in 1960, yeah, I guess you probably.
I have no idea.
I don't know.
But that is how I think we have to remember that when we look at people's behavior and how we look at least in my business, disappearances. We have to look at the situation in which the time it happened. And so it's very extreme between 1968 and 2021, but we could even say something maybe even about, even if it were the 1980s, or if we wanted to even go back further, and I did cover disappearance going back to the 1940s. The era, certainly, especially when it comes to women, because women have a lot more choices now, education, getting, advanced degrees, lawyers, mayors, vice president of the United States. Those things all have to be taken into consideration when you are looking at a disappearance and the facts surrounding it. It is that is absolutely true. So as cultures change, the analyzation or an analysis of facts should also change.
So you have to look at it in the context of the decade or the time period.
That's right, because I don't think there are any allegations that Donna, even though heroin was around in the 1960s, I don't think there are any allegations that she was an addict.
Right.
So it must have been something else.
Naturally assume.
Yeah.
That she was.
You wouldn't. Or not. These days, absolutely.
Right. Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to the Peltzman Effect, which I've never heard of.
You've never heard of that?
I have never heard of that.
It is something in economics, and it's a form of cost benefit analysis. In that, and a well-known example of this is car seatbelts. When cars were first mandated to have seatbelts back in the 1960s, it became law. Of course, you can look at old cars from the 1950s. If you watch like the Barrett-Jackson auction or the Mecum auction on TV, you see a lot of those cars do not have seatbelts, or there was a lap belts or something. Well, finally, we got the 3-point seatbelt that we're all familiar with today. Well, they were doing a study of, how many people's lives is this going to save? And certainly seatbelts have been excellent, for car safety. There's no doubt about that. However, at least at the beginning, what was discovered is the deaths didn't go down. It didn't change as much as they thought. Why? Because as soon as you tell people that they can put these seatbelts on and they're going to be safer in crashes and they have more likely chance of surviving, what happens? People start driving faster. And so you drive faster, you're more likely then to get into an accident. Yeah. And so that keeps the number of crashes and deaths at a level that's a little higher than they expected, given that seatbelts were once again eventually mandated. That's called the Peltzman Effect. When you don't take in people's understandings of things. And this is common through any part of living on Earth that you want to think about, is when you tell people that they can do something, we're going to do something that's going to make you safer, the more likely they are to push the boundaries. That is just something that is innate to us as humans. But it's most closely associated with seatbelts in cars in the 1960s. So
what you're saying is that because we have so many things that you would think would keep us safe, like cell phones, whatever, that doesn't really change the number of people going missing. I mean, it has dropped, right?
Well, it has dropped, but if you think about it this way, when I cover disappearances from the 1990s, rarely do we even talk about cell phones, even though cell phones, of course, were kind of a thing they started being a thing in the 1990s.
Right.
And of course, even in the 1980s, the very super wealthy had, very rudimentary cell phones. But you would think with the advent of cell phones in the 21st century, with video cameras, and of course, we don't need VHS tapes. We can just download it right to our hard drive, and cameras are so tiny, they're on our phones. All of these things put together, you would think what I would call the surveillance state. And I don't mean that in a conspiracy way. I just mean we don't realize how many, trail of breadcrumbs that we leave from everything that we do. You would think that disappearances would be zero between our cell phone usage, all of the traffic cameras and cameras I have in my building here, in this condo building that I live in, all over the place. Our social media presence, Google, pinging and all these things. You would think nobody would go missing at all. But what happens? Well, with the Peltzman Effect, you have people out there who are killers. And they know this stuff too. They know what GPS does. They know about social media. They know about video cameras. And so that's not going to stop them from what they want to do. So they find out ways to get around those things. So once again, it's the Peltzman Effect. The more you try to add safety to people, the more people who want to do bad things are going to find ways around it. And a very good example of this was just the disappearance we covered a couple weeks ago, Pearl Pinson. It's obvious to me that, and we now know from Fernando Castro's Google searches, that he looked up GPS and phones and turning them on off and everything. So when he attacked her, it was a stranger on stranger crime, which is very rare. Yeah. And he knew to leave his phones at home. He also knew she had two phones. Pearl had two phones. He made sure that they were left behind as well. So even though he had a phone and she had two phones, there was no tracking because he knew that GPS, if we kept the phones on, it would track him wherever he went. Now, we know almost for sure that unfortunately Fernando murdered Pearl. What we don't know is where she is because, once again, they weren't able to track him because he knew that he would be tracked after he abducted Pearl. So this is what we call the Peltzman Effect, that the better we try to make things, there are people that are going to try to get around them because, once again, of human nature, especially if you're a killer.
Okay. Well, so you talk about signal and noise, I think we may have already discussed.
We kind of touched upon that with Brenda Condon's disappearance. Right. When we look at a particular scene of a crime, of a disappearance, whether it's a house, a bar, a person's car, or whatever, how do we pick out the things that actually mean something? And how do we discard the things that don't mean anything? And being that I've talked about this, I think I've written about this before. There was an old Law and Order game on CD or something, maybe 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. I remember my sister Diane got it for me, and it was really good. But in that game, you had to go into a crime scene, and you had to figure out, well, what items are part of the crime and which ones aren't. Right. This is the same thing with disappearances. You're presented with a ton of facts. Which ones mean something and which don't? Going back to Brenda Condon's, the boots in the men's restroom. Does that mean something or it doesn't? And it's very important in trying to establish trends and theories regarding disappearances or anything else that you make sure that you're concentrating on the signal and not on the noise. And that I get that saying from, what's the guy that does the 538 blog, the very well-known pollster and him, but I can't think of his name, but he wrote a book called The Signal and the Noise. And the noise is everything that doesn't mean anything. And the signal is what you want to concentrate on. And it's very difficult in disappearances, once again, because we can't ask the missing person because he or she is gone. He or she would surely know what the important parts are and which ones aren't so important or irrelevant, but we can't ask him or her because they're not around. It's very difficult in disappearances to concentrate on those facts, which really mean something, that are going to, point us in the right direction. So do you have any final words of wisdom about logic and reasoning?
Well,
what I like about disappearances, a guy who was on the program, his name is Tad Tobias. He is the foremost authority in the United States, and because it's the United States, because we're arrogant Americans, we think the world.
That's right.
He is the expert in no body murder cases. He was a former federal prosecutor. I still email him once in a while, but he has a website. But he's a specialist. So sometimes when some jurisdiction is wanting to prosecute a suspect in what they suspect is a murder, even though no remains have been found, Tad DeBise might be asked to come in and take a look at the evidence and everything. And even he says that disappearances are the toughest of the toughest cases that law enforcement ever has to work. Much more difficult than serial killers, much more difficult than any, child rape, child abuse, like with the Catholic Church, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Disappearances are the most difficult because of what we've talked about today. And, but unfortunately, what also happens in missing persons cases is because they are so tough, there's a lot of burnout. We also must understand that very few police departments in the United States have missing persons units. Only the biggest of the biggest. Chicago, New York City, Houston, LA. Most little jurisdictions do not. They have nothing. Nothing.
Right.
Even in those departments where they have missing persons units, the turnover is very high because of something we talked about very early on, is that you do get a lot of people crying wolf. Oh, my daughter's gone. She's never coming back. She's gone. She's dead, everything. And, these investigators get all hyped up about trying to figure out. And then she comes strutting back in 3 days. Oh, hey, Mom, I was over in Vegas. Sorry, I didn't. Well, that can be very demoralizing to investigators who are trying to take it seriously. And so it's not unusual for my guests, just even with disappearances that are 10 years old, to have 5 different investigators over 10 years.
Wow.
Getting passed on. And every time that investigator is learning from scratch. And every time you're getting further and further and further away from when the disappearance happened, which doesn't help either.
Wow.
So it's a double whammy.
You chose the most difficult thing to do because you're Ed Dentzel.
That's right. It's something that needs to be done. I cannot tell you how much this has enriched my life over the last 4.5 years. The people that I've met, this is my assistants, and what I like to say about my assistants, all of them are here by choice. They heard the program at one time or another and said, you know what? That's something I want to be a part of. And I would tell that to any person out there who's starting anything, a podcast, your own business or something. You don't need to check reviews or downloads or anything else. When people want to start putting in their time to help you do what you want to do, that's how you know whether you have a good program or not. Nothing else really matters. Nothing, all the other stuff, views and downloads and stuff, that's just vanity. When people want to be involved in what you're doing, that's when you know that you're on the right track and you're doing good work. And I cannot tell you how much I thank those people, and I'll name them: Emily, Cherie, Carrie, Heather, Eric, Natasha, who have come aboard, and they do such great jobs behind the scenes. And but we all know it's difficult, and so you have to be a happy warrior. If you're getting into this because you're trying to be a hero, then you're not going to be doing this for very long, because this is difficult. Yeah. So you have to be a happy warrior.
So you have a website, right? So I
do. The Unfound Podcast .com. That's the website. My assistant, Natasha, manages it. She does a great job. I think it's a great website. A lot of information, videos, and links to all of the websites that we go to, databases, things like that. There's a data gem section of the website that I think people will be interested in, all sorts of different links. Then we're on Facebook, the Facebook discussion group, which has, around 8,000 people in it now. I can remember when it had 62 people in it, April, in October, November of 2017. It had like 62 people in it. We had the Facebook page. It has it's had over 8,000 likes or something like that. We're on, of course, Instagram. I'm on Twitter. I do the live show, which I love doing. It's one of the few live shows that any true crime podcast host does on Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern on the Unfound podcast channel on YouTube. I love it. We do a lot of great stuff there. Always uploading new videos, map analyses, of disappearances that we've covered. So we got a lot going on. I got a lot going on, April. I could never do it by myself. That's why I'm so happy to have the assistants that do these things, and the people who contact me, my assistants, about being on the program. My assistant, Emily, is mainly responsible for finding guests, reaching out to people. So it's quite a project we have going on here.
So if people, there may be people out there who have missing people in their life. Can they contact you?
Mm-hmm.
Or?
Absolutely. You can email me at unfoundpodcast@gmail.com, or you can find me on Facebook. I'm easy to find. I use my real name and everything else. I have a Facebook page, a private Facebook page, just like everybody else. Just look for Edward Dentzel. Send me a message, friend me, and we can start talking. And everything that we talk about will be confidential and off the record. The only thing that will ever be on the record is the actual interview we do for the episode.
Well, this has been so fascinating, and thank you so much for joining me on my podcast today.
Yeah, well, I want the listeners to know that April Hebert, one of my favorite people, I want them to know, one of my favorite people from working at Star Trek. We have a lot of mutual friends who I know think very, very highly of her as well. She is a hoot. I don't know that you know exactly the kind of persona she displays. I've listened to a couple episodes, but I'm telling you, behind the scenes, she's a hoot. She's a great person, and people think of her very highly, going back to our Star Trek days.
Thank you, Ed.
You're welcome.
I hope you found that conversation as fascinating as I did. What Ed and his team are doing is so necessary, and I'm sure the families and friends of these missing people are grateful for the attention that the Unfound Podcast brings to their cases. And I appreciate the structured, reasoned way that Ed approaches each case, and that the focus is on facts and evidence, keeping speculation and conjecture to a minimum. I'll put lots of links in the show notes so you can check them out. And I hope that you use the information in this episode to help you think it through.